This just in, Sudan's Burhan has issued a decree relieving the civilian members of the Sovereign Council from their duties. So for more, our international affairs commentator Doug Herbert joins me in the studio. Hi, Doug. So as we've seen, Sudan's protesters are still standing firm. Can you tell us more about what he said, the announcement that he made, and why it didn't convince?
Yeah, well, the second part of that question is a lot easier. The announcement he made is essentially he said he got up there, and this is al-Burhan. This is the army chief who brutally took power in a coup last October, a coup that disrupted what had been Sudan's transition to civilian rule, was supposed to be the transition. And he basically said, time to make way for a true civilian government. Put the people in power, a civilian government that will have, quote, executive powers. He said, don't worry, the army will not take place in these talks in this government. But it came, the announcement, with a very big caveat. Of course, he didn't call it a caveat, but he slipped in there the fact that he's disbanding the Sovereign Council, which is now the ruling body. And in its place would come, with this new fangled civilian government, a Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And what that essentially is a new body which would be responsible for defense and security, and presumably it would be there alongside this new civilian government. However, it would not be, at least there was no sign that it would be accountable to anyone, to any government. Also embedded in this announcement was the suspicion among many protesters, well-founded perhaps, that the army and its armed allies, other groups in society, would retain all of their economic privileges. So much of Sudan's resources are in the hands of the army, of these armed groups, these shady armed groups, accountable to no one. They control the country's economy, which is in more than dire shape right now. Protesters heard this and they said, we can't trust this guy and his announcement more than we can throw him. Basically, they have seen, in their eyes, the absolute havoc that he has wrought on the country since he came in and took over last October. Remember, the country had been in the midst of an ongoing 2-year transition following the ouster by the army in 2019, you'll remember this, of the longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. That was great news for the country. We saw sit-ins, protests, we saw a lot of jubilation in society. Didn't last long because since then there has been sustained, yes, sit-ins, but alongside the resistance of society, there's been a lot of crackdown and repression.
And Doug, so what do you think the international has been or is likely to be?
Yeah,
these announcements?
The international community has been wishy-washy. There's just no other word for it. Basically, what their official line has been is they have been encouraging all sides to seek a solution on the way forward in order to find a way to forge some consensus between the military and the civilians. Basically asking the Sudanese to do what the army has signally shown it is incapable of doing, and that is really making way for civilians. That is sidelining any role for army, paramilitary forces, armed forces. That hasn't happened. So the international community has sort of tried to stand above the fray, and it's done this both sidesism. Well, both sides should try to reach out to one another. From the protesters' standpoint, you know, that's going nowhere, basically. So the U.S. basically says it's too early to tell what will come of this, but still officially encouraging some sort of consensus moving forward. The UN Secretary General as well is talking of this sort of forging a consensus, saying they're watching what Sudan will do next. But there's been no real denunciation, so to speak, since this announcement on the same scale of what the protesters are saying, that this is a transparent ruse, as the protesters call it, by the army chief, al-Burhan, to retain power. The international community is trying to still play it sort of neutral. You know, he said, she said, let's see what happens. So the reaction of the international community, when it's come at all, has been very non-committal, to say the least.
All the more surprising given all the transitions that haven't been happening in West Africa as well, Doug. So Sudan has been ruled mostly by military government since independence. Protesters, you've said, have heard it before. Do you think it's realistic to expect that we'll see civilian governance anytime soon?
Depends how much pressure is brought to bear on these army chiefs. Remember what I just said about the international community. Ultimately, they're going to have a giant role in this. But let's not count out the resilience of the protesters. Now, since the coup last October, by some estimates, 114 protesters have been killed killed. There have been a series of sit-ins throughout the city. There are 3 big sit-ins right now, one in the center of Khartoum, the capital, and 2 on the outskirts of Khartoum. These protesters, in the face of not just rubber bullets and tear gas, but last Thursday, which was what triggered the latest absolute outrage from protesters, live bullets were fired during the protests last Thursday. So we're having ongoing protests despite that. And last Thursday alone, 9 people were killed in these protests. So in the face of this brutal, horrific crackdown, repression by the armed forces, the protesters have said they have no choice but to stand their ground, to hunker down, to dig in, and to forge forward. So normally you'd look at Sudan's recent history. They've been independent since 1956. They have had military governments for all but 10 years since then. All but 10 years they've had military governments. You'd say, wow, it's a real uphill struggle. Add in the fact that the currency is devalued, inflation's at 200%. Most people are barely making ends meet right now. And these protesters, yet they keep continuing. So the resilience speaks for a lot. And who knows if at a certain point, if the international community were to wake up and have a tougher line, if the protesters, and it was to converge with that continued protest movement, maybe this junta could break. What would follow? Who knows? Maybe a junta by another name. But for now, it looks like, and you just made that announcement that Burhan is dismissing civilians from the Sovereign Council, it looks like not only is he not getting the message from the protesters, but he is digging in and sticking to his ground because he probably doesn't think that he's going to meet that much resistance beyond the protests, which he probably thinks he can dispose of relatively easily.
History tells us you can only resist pressure from the streets for so long, Doug. We'll see what will happen next. Doug Herbert, thank you very much.